My job is simply to hand over to Anthony. And Anthony, I believe you'll be leading this interview with Edward. So welcome to the Conflict Avoidance Coalition. I'm sorry we've had some technical problems, but I think, Anthony, I'll hand over to you as one of our key members on the coalition and a member of the steering group and also one of the officers to introduce our first guest. And we're going to then have a second guest, Ian, who'll follow around about 10 o'clock. So welcome, and over to you, Anthony.
Well, thank you, Richard, and welcome everyone. And sorry, we've had these technical glitches at the beginning. I'm aware that some of you may have to leave early, so we'll play this by ear as we go. But I've got some questions prepared. Firstly, I'm going to introduce Ed Shriver, who I'll be interviewing today, and it's going to be more like just a conversation. And perhaps I'll start by asking. Well, let me explain. So I'm the chair of the contract group. So the contract group is part of the coalition, and our mission really is to promote the benefits of contract standardization, because of course we benefit greatly in the construction industry from having standard form contracts, but routinely amended by law firms, which create huge problems for contractors in terms of negotiating those amendments and trying to mitigate risk. And then the group as a whole, of course, is concerned with avoiding conflict. And I think one of the principles in the contract group that we support is that conflict avoidance starts with a contract. So if you start with a fair contract, the likelihood of disputes arising is going to be reduced. So Ed, over to you. If perhaps you could just give us a little introduction about VVB and your role there.
Yeah, thank you, Anthony. So I'm the Group Commercial Director for VVB. I'm effectively responsible for the commercial procurement and project controls / planning team for VVB. I have a bit of a dual role. I'm also the Contracts Performance Director, which is an interesting title and seems to cover all manner of sins, for a company called Anthrope, which is a joint venture with Aegis. And that is project specific for the mechanical and electrical fit out on the Old Oak Common Station. In terms of VVB, we're a mechanical and electrical firm. We generally deal with large infrastructure projects, and we deal with that on all manner of levels. So on some projects, we provide operatives and labour only. We provide sort of expertise support all the way through to kind of full turnkey solutions for mechanical and electrical installations. So that's from design all the way through to manufacture, install, and also commissioning and maintenance. We work across a number of sectors. Hopefully some of you have heard of us. So we work across highways, rail, in particular on High Speed 2, across energy, fire, power and tunnelling, and renewable energy.
And then what's within VVB, what's your role, and which of the other members of the teams do you kind of report to and work with?
Head up the commercial procurement section, so deal a lot with contracts. There's a lot kind of pre and post contract negotiation. So having to get my head into terms and conditions an awful lot, which has kind of obviously really kind of fostered my interest in the conflict avoidance pledge and the coalition. I've got a number of senior personnel that report into me that generally head up sort of individual regional areas, and that's across the commercial and the procurement sort of functions as such.
So, contracts are clearly something that come across your desk quite regularly. So, yeah. What was it that first interested you in the coalition? How did you hear about it, and then what made you want to get involved?
It was really off the back of it's about 2.5 years ago. We just had gone through a rather painful sort of forward dispute process. We effectively won in inverted commas, but I think as anyone who's experienced it, no one ever really wins. So that kind of increased my kind of interest in there must be a better way of doing this. We spent an awful lot of money to effectively stand still, and that just didn't seem right. And when I sort of did a bit of research, the conflict avoidance pledge and cap certainly came up. So registered a level of interest, which led to a conversation with Martin and Uzella. And that conversation was really to understand a little bit more about what the pledge was all around, about RICS's involvement at that time, but also to see how I personally and VVB as an organisation could really support what we're trying to achieve with the pledge. And I think at the time there's probably not a great involvement of suppliers of our kind of size. So it probably added a little bit of a different context to the conversations that we're having at that point. And then from there, yeah, led to kind of increasing involvement as a business and as an individual. So ended up taking on the role as vice chair, and also us achieving gold standard about 2 years ago.
Are you able to share with us any of the pain points that really prompted you to look into this further? You mentioned that particular dispute, and that you ended up putting a lot of energy, effort, and resources in, but actually coming out no better off. Obviously anonymized, but I mean, what were the kind of the key things that you kind of learnt or wanted to improve from that experience?
I think from a supplier point of view, and I've dealt with adjudications on a number of levels, both in sort of tier one larger organizations and in tier two. So I kind of have seen it from a couple of sides. I think the pain element is really, it's getting to that point where there's lack of any other solution, or the parties believe there's a lack of any other solution. And invariably, we always seem to end up in a position when we end up in these disputes of, right, we kind of look at the legal points, we look at the kind of entitlement points, we look at the monetary points, and then we start to set our kind of stall out in terms of, right, well, these are our strengths, these are our sort of things that we think are potentially a risk. And then we start to kind of do this process of, well, what's a good result, what's a bad result, what's a minimum position, and so on. And there never didn't feel like there was a mechanism by which we could collectively have those kind of conversations to come to an agreement. It always felt like we'd go through that process, and then we'd sit entrenched in our separate camps, and we just were adamant, either through advice or through fear that anything you give away would be used against you, that these kind of sort of negotiation points and these points of compromise just cannot be shared. And there wasn't an environment to be able to do that. And therefore, there was no way to actually reach a kind of, not necessarily a positive outcome, but an acceptable outcome. So all we ended up on all the adjudications I've been involved with is spending an awful lot of money on advice, and having to, certainly from a sort of tier two supply perspective, having to ward off things like, well, we know they're going to get a legal team involved, so we're going to have no choice but to get a legal team involved. And it just felt that adjudication as it was intended, which is this kind of cost-effective, time-effective process, was fundamentally broken. I mean, I don't think any of the ones I'm involved with did not involve lawyers, did not involve experts, and the majority of them involved some sort of King's Counsel or Queen's Counsel involvement. And that, to me, although that's good advice on occasions that's being given, deters away from, I think, what the intent of it was. So it feels like there's not that middle ground in there that we can rely upon to come to an amicable solution that keeps the money within the industry.
These are very powerful words, I'd say, Edward. And can I ask, you mentioned you've been involved in several adjudications. Have those been as the referring party or as the responding party, or has it been a bit of a mix of both?
A mixture of both. I'd probably say about 50-50.
Yeah.
And there's an element there of trying to go through the number of steps to reach a position. And often from the tier two perspective, there's a potential where if there's money involved, it's a case of, well, how long can we keep going, waiting to try and reach a resolution to get the money that we need to run a business before we have no choice but to kind of go down that route. And we've been very open and honest about that, to say, look, we've got a cutoff point here where we can no longer keep funding projects to this level. We have to do something about it. And look, have we administered every contract absolutely perfectly? No, of course we haven't. I don't think anyone ever really does. but that is the intention. And it doesn't help with the point you brought up at the start there around when the contracts get so fundamentally amended, it makes it very difficult because it just opens up avenues for further sort of arguments to be made and further delay in reaching that kind of amicable solution.
So this is really interesting because it leads to my next question, which is about how do we influence the stakeholders that are involved to sign up to the principle of conflict avoidance and then ideally to sign the pledge. Do you think there's any? Yeah. So what does the future look like? Where can we go to bring round more of a coalition of stakeholders with this same ambition?
Yeah, good question. I think we've tried to do it on two levels. We tried to do it sort of up the chain with clients, and we've tried to do it with down the chain with suppliers. Up the chain with clients, there's mixed success there. You sometimes get, and we as a business, we are sometimes operating as a tier one directly with National Highways, Network Rail, TfL, and so on. And we're sometimes contracting into a major tier one ourselves as a tier two supplier to the likes of Balfour BT, Vonsi, and Strabag, and so on. So we kind of see different makeups of those organizations, and some are very much aware of things like the pledge and aware of kind of the pros of having some sort of mediatory process embedded into the dispute resolution process. Some are not, frankly. And a lot of it depends on who we're talking to within the organisation, whether they've got the delegated level authority to have kind of sensible conversations about can we introduce better ways of doing this. And that starts with reducing the amount of contract amendments to standard forms of contract, but also, to contradict myself a bit here, embedding elements of contract compliance with things like mediation or the pledge or so on, better ways of resolving disputes, or hopefully not reaching a dispute in the first place. So yeah, we've had mixed success with that. And I find sometimes the challenge is around, well, we're a tier two, we're talking to a tier one about the pros of doing this, but actually, do they have the governance to be able to amend the contracts? Sometimes they are pledge signatories themselves, and they still won't be able to amend the contract to include that as a mandatory step within that process. Other times, we're probably just dealing with people that are too far down the chain that don't have the delegated level of authority to be able to make those kinds of decisions. And that's fair enough. We understand that, but we always try to get to the point of promoting it anyway and asking to have escalated discussions to be able to present what the pledge is all about. So we've done that a couple of times, and that has led to successful embedment on a couple of contracts. So that worked well. And on one of those contracts, just the very fact we had that in the contract allowed us to resolve a dispute amicably. We got to the point of almost using the pledge to its fullest strength, but we didn't quite get there because actually what having the pledge in the contract allowed us to do was set some of the ground rules of our behaviours and how we're going to try and deal with these kind of conflicts. So that was really useful, just to have it in the contract itself. With suppliers, we have it as a mandatory inclusion in all of our contracts down to supply chain, whether it be on a PSC type form or a full subcontract or just our standard sort of PO terms and conditions. So that helps to just know that it's always in there and it's always a fallback. Suppliers sometimes sort of question it and ask what it's all about, and that gives an opportunity to kind of go through why we're supporting it so much and why we're asking them to effectively sign up to a contract that has it embedded as a mandatory kind of part of any kind of escalation. We've also held sort of several seminars with our supply chain, because I think one of the gaps we have at the moment is having things like material and labour suppliers really embedded into the pledge and understanding, you know, the benefits of having it as part of their organisation.
So could I just ask a little bit of detail around the clauses that you include in your supplier contracts? Is that taken from the conflict avoidance pledge?
Yeah. So that's using the wording that's been developed over the last couple of years. There is sometimes a bit of shoehorning to make sure it's appropriate for also the type of contract that we're using. So it's adapted to suit, but it follows exactly the same principles.
Do you want to just remind everyone here kind of what that says? Is it essentially sort of a collaborative working and sort of a bit like the JCT, for example? It's got a collaborative working obligation to act in good faith, but also a notification of disputes obligation, which means that before you can escalate a dispute to a formal dispute resolution mechanism, you need to get the top tier executives together to try and put their heads together and at least identify what the dispute is. And I think that can, totally with the JCT, that provision is hugely powerful now because it's become mandatory in the JCT 2024 editions. So it means that you can narrow down the dispute so that you don't have a myriad of disputes, which the lawyers like to get their teeth into when it comes to, for example, an adjudication.
Yeah, exactly that. So in a number of the contracts, there is generally always a level of escalation to director level or the appropriate senior level to have the kind of discussions to try to reach resolution. And that's great and that's good. But I think sometimes we've found that you're generally sort of going through that process and you know that you're just being given a bit of lip service and there's no actual real kind of commitment to reaching an amicable resolution. Other times it's worked okay and pretty well. So we've gone a bit of a step further and we've effectively mandated that before you go to adjudication or formal dispute resolution, you need to have a crack at having a mediated type approach to reaching a resolution. So effectively, yes, okay, the directors can try or the senior personnel can try and resolve it themselves. If they can't for whatever reason, then we are going to get a mediator type third party involved, and they're not there to create a judgment call. And that's one of the issues I think we found with adjudication is, effectively you have someone making a judgment, you have a winner and a loser, or you have a middle ground, which generally neither party is particularly happy with. Or even worse, you end up with a bit of a kind of inconclusive result from it. The beauty of having some sort of mediated type approach is that the parties are reaching agreement. So they are reaching a level that they already know is acceptable to themselves. Otherwise, they wouldn't be agreeing to it. And that's the bit for us is, we don't want to create further elements of winner and loser. There's been a significant number of suppliers over the last few years that have ended up in insolvency, and that's just not good for the industry. So having a level where suppliers have been put under financial pressure to make bad decisions is just not a way I think the industry can progress.
Yes, and I think by sort of coming to the end of my questions, but this is, I think, the really important one, which is how can we better sort of educate those within our own organizations, and perhaps more importantly to other organizations, of the benefits of the Conflict Avoidance Coalition and how it can, bring improvements to, in terms of conflict avoidance.
I think awareness is key. And I'm not sure if Len's on the call, but Len's been fantastic. I think we can all recognise at promoting the pledge and the Conflict Avoidance Coalition and making sure that it becomes known within the industry. I think the fact that we've got a growing signatory base is a start of it. I think involvement in these kind of organisations, where we have people who support it, not only in terms of signing the pledge, but also actually wanting to spend time and get involved and try to improve the way that we manage and deal with disputes through this forum. I've kind of held a couple of training sessions, certainly with my team, so that they're aware of it and understand it, so they can communicate it better to suppliers. Because ultimately, yes, I see a number of different people at different levels, but the more I can promote that amongst my team and amongst other organisations that we deal closely with, the better people can kind of promote it with the people that they communicate with. So yeah, promotion's absolutely key. I think the turning point for us was really mandating it within our contracts, because that meant that there had to be some sort of buy-in from the supply chain that we deal with. Is now part of our onboarding process as well. So where we're dealing with the various different accreditation suppliers need to have, signing of the pledge and understanding of what the pledge is, has become one of those questions. Now, we haven't said that if you don't sign the pledge, we cannot onboard you, but it's definitely strongly encouraged, and the next step probably is mandating that process.
Yeah, I'd imagine it's a bit harder to mandate it going up the supply chain.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah, I mean that is the big problem, isn't it? Okay, I think I'll stop there and invite any questions from the rest of the participants here. Richard.
Yes, thanks, Ed. That was really interesting. I did put something in the chat about what your definition of winning is, but actually, what I find really interesting is the sort of challenge to the statutory adjudication that we have, and going back to when statutory adjudication came in after Latham, modelled on the NEC, it was very much around having an engineer, primarily a contract administrator, who would often be appointed before the work started and was there available to go to the site and provide pretty much the service that you said, this is what we want.
Yeah.
Of course, the courts found that this wasn't the correct interpretation of adjudication. And I think we do need straight lines with the law, otherwise fuzzy edges just create more disputes. But do you feel that the industry is now saying there's a need for this service, and where should we go? I look at the lawyers here, Jeremy and others. What's your view on this, and where we should perhaps be going? Who should we be talking to?
So from my perspective, first, I think it depends where you sit within the industry. I think certainly from our perspective as a tier 2, sometimes a tier 1, and the kind of levels that we operate at, I think there's absolutely a need for it. I think there is a disproportionate level of how much financial backing now probably supports things like adjudication and so on now. So anything we can do to kind of level that playing field to get back to the principles of the contract and making suppliers and contractors and clients more interdependent with each other, it is absolutely key.
Thank you.
Any other questions? So I think that's perfect timing, 10 o'clock. Richard, can I hand back to you?
But by all means, and I'm just going to hand over straight to Jeremy. Jeremy's a leading member of the steering group, very experienced construction lawyer with Fenwick Elliott, working internationally, and also looking at alternatives, particularly bringing in overseas experience. I think that's part of what Jeremy is giving to us. Although Fenwick Elliott, he tells me, are purely construction lawyers, and don't venture much beyond that, which is actually quite unusual. But Jeremy's going to hand over. I'm going to hand over to you now to interview Ian, again a stalwart of the steering group and another officer of our group, our coalition. So over to you, Jeremy.
That's great. Thank you, Richard. Thanks, Ed, for all, and Anthony for all your comments. Just briefly, Richard, in response to the sort of question you just threw out, how do you change things? I mean, I think it's a mixture of all the things that Anthony and Ed were highlighting. It's almost like behavioural change. It's changed by people seeing the benefits of firms like VVB and some of the things that the FIS do, see the benefits that they may bring to those organisations. It's also, and then there's the more practical things that you need to do. Perhaps, engage more with the contract drafters, the people who draft the standard contracts, what needs to be done more there. And also, there is going to be an element of engaging with governments, changing policies and everything. The government has a number of procurement policies. If the government can, encourage the government to be leading by example, to adopting a mandating approach is similar to the coalitions within the government contracts, and that is happening to some degree already, then things follow suit. But I think that's a much wider discussion, and it's one of the reasons that the coalition is so important, because it brings together such a wide group of organisations, etc., from throughout the construction industry, which brings me on to the second discussion set for this morning, which is with Ian McElwee, who is very fortunate that he is our treasurer of the coalition. He's also the CEO of the FIS, which is the trade body for the finishers and interiors sector. But I must confess, Ian, I don't necessarily know that much about what your actual role within the FIS actually is and what you actually do. And it might be helpful if you could just briefly outline that for us.
I always find it's best to keep it vague, Jeremy, but this won't be the first time I've been interviewed by a lawyer, but I'm sure this is not under caution. So thank you, Jeremy, for your kind introduction. So I am Chief Executive.
Just say yes.
Yes. No comment. I'm Ian McElwee, Chief Executive of FIS, as Jeremy just said. So we're the trade body for the £13 billion finishes interior sector. So we've got within our membership, it's about 600 companies just over, who are mostly main fit out and specialist subcontractors who all work as either principal contractors or contractors in the new regulatory environment, and are sort of mostly involved in either delivering complete fit outs or building the walls, ceilings, floors within the fit out packages. We've also got manufacturers and suppliers in our membership. So it's those sort of products that are used in the delivery of our projects. And I think that makes us quite unique because we're a supply chain organisation, which means I don't really get away with blaming somebody else for our problems. We've actually got to start to find ways to work together, which makes us very solutions focused. So primarily, my job is to make sure that we run a tight ship, and our job is to scan the horizon for our community, identified risk, and help remove friction from the supply chain. We also focus on innovation and opportunity, but I'll be honest, the reality of our work is we spend more time dealing with risk than we do opportunities, sadly. A lot of our work is, we get into some quite deep technical work, and we do a lot of work around competence and skill, but we also spend a lot of time, and frankly far too much time, supporting our members with legal and contractual matters, both directly and through a network of specialist providers that we have on hand when things get beyond the competence that we have to deal with. And sadly, we've seen an increase in the usage of this service in recent years, particularly around legacy claims associated with the Building Safety Act. So we've seen a real uptick in that. So you know, we are dealing with more legal claims than we ever, or legal issues than we ever have. And I think sort of this sector, for those who don't know of it, you know, we often call it the fast fit out sector, but there's four key risks in construction. So you've got compliance and design, which are kind of linked together: time, cost, and cash. And I genuinely believe the fit out sector, we feel this most intently, because there's a lot of packages coming together, all working in a confined space, and all having to collaborate without necessarily the time for collaboration being factored in. You know, the tender and procurement processes in this sector are so rapid. You can be sort of 6 weeks from invitation to tender to boots on site on a relatively large fit out project. And we're building on the problems of others. So often we're moving into a building that's either been previously built or it's a new building, but we've got to accommodate tolerances that have built up through the program. We've got accelerated programs because time slipped elsewhere. The budget's running tight. There's nowhere else to make savings, so we're the last people there. So we're going to get squeezed, and everything's happening at pace. It can be quite fragmented. And we're seeing that sort of design process creep into the next stage down. So a lot more specialist packages now being let as design packages, which ingrains more potential for dispute, because frankly the plan of works was never really designed to deal with the fragmented design process that we do see now. So you know, it's a fast moving, it's a complex sector, and unfortunately it is prone to dispute, and we bake that into the way we work, right? So we've done some research with Rennes University, and you know, we look at sort of some of the contractual issues that we have in contract, But when we talk about design development and we say how often, one of the questions we asked was how often do you go back to get a design decision confirmed within your contractual limit, or how often do you get it the time confirmed within your contractual limit? 27% say never, and 1% say only 1% say always. So we're kind of building up points of dispute through the program, and then they come to a head very much at the end.
Okay, that's really helpful, and I think it gives a lot of clues and hints as to why or when you first became interested in the work of the coalition and why the work and aims of the coalition were of interest to you. But perhaps if you could just elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think I've probably inspired into the Conflict Avoidance Coalition because I think I met Len. I can't remember when I first met Len, and I'm not claiming it was love at first sight, but he has been one of those people that's inspired me throughout the last sort of 8 or 9 years that we've been working together. I think he also reintroduced me to Martin Burns, who is another person who's had a big impact on my career. And I worked with Martin on an alternative dispute resolution process nearly 20 years ago. And at the time, I don't think I fully understood, but we were it was a mediation-led process that was effectively baking in conflict avoidance. Because, again, I think all of us here have probably been involved in one of those disputes. And whilst I'm very youthful looking, I am old enough to remember when that box of files hit your desk, and it sort of landed with a bump that was sort of as heavy on your desk as it was on your heart, because you realised you were going to be wading through folders and folders of stuff, often which was nothing to do with the real crux of the dispute, but because somebody decided they were going to win their argument with volume of information rather than specificity. And I think and part of that's the frustration in doing a job like I do. It's a privilege, but also the stuff we're dealing with is often systemic issues. The things people want me to fix is, why do we amend standard form contracts? Why do we continue to behave like this when every piece of conventional wisdom, every piece of research into construction has said this is bonkers? The way you behave is bonkers. And I think why now? Because the timing is what's different this time, that we've got a new regulatory regime, right? And at the heart of that is a focus on duty and competence, and those really are the essence of conflict avoidance. Understand and abdicate your duty and deliver it with competence, right? And within competence, we talk about behaviours now, and that really has caused us to look at the individual roles. And at the moment, there's a lot of flurry around, is the person doing the dry lining on site competence to do dry lining? But actually, now the spotlight is turning onto those other roles in our businesses, and making sure people understand competence, understand what it means to be competent. And actually, I think if you look at that, we've written an integrated management standard recently. And one of the things is a lot of people working in construction have no idea how contracts work. The contract is only pulled out at the end of the job to have a bun fight. It's not something that we use to manage the process. And we did a round table last year with the Small Business Coalition, and Sally Geyer from the World Commerce and Contracting came along, and she sort of nailed it for me. This again inspired me, because she said a phrase which is that we contract in construction for the divorce and not the marriage. The contract should be helping us, but actually we're using them just at the end of that job and I think that's why I think it feels like now is the time to really up the volume on this, because regulation is demanding change, and change does start here. We don't call ourselves contractors for nothing, right? It's essential. It's embedded in who we are.
Yeah, I think that's right, isn't it? Your contract's a project management tool. It should contain a number of the tools to help you get the job done, as agreed between the parties. And I think just to pause for a minute, you mentioned both Len Bunton and Martin Burns and the influence they've had on encouraging you to join the coalition. I think that's probably true for many of the members of the coalition, if not all the members of the coalition. I think their influence is something that we all value. And Len has commented in the chat about how your members have been responding superbly to supporting the pledge, and commented that during contract reviews they seek to embed the conflict avoidance clauses into contracts. How successful are you in being able to do that?
Well, I mean, if I take a step back before I answer that, Jeremy, I think like
Yeah.
we're trying to bake this conflict avoidance sort of mindset into the way that we work. So it's at the front of everything we do. So our sort of a central campaign in our organisation at the moment, built out of the work we did with Reading University around some of the challenges we face in the supply chain, is that there is a theme in all of this that, you know, whilst the people shouldn't ask, there's always somebody who's willing to say yes, right? And actually, what undermines construction is, you know, and I remember sitting down with Peter Rogers at the sort of with my Reading University research and said, Peter, what do I do with this? And he sort of said to me, and he said, your job really in all of this is to encourage people and help people say no. So we've got a campaign that we run through FIS, and it's something I'd encourage. It's not our campaign; it's something that we've started, but I'd love the whole industry to take on. But it's all about responsible no. It's about helping people to articulate and explain why it's not appropriate for them to maybe sign a contract. You know, it's much easier to say I'm not insured. I'd love to, but I'm not insured to do that, than sort of get into a sort of a bun fight over contractual clauses and terms. So, you know, so we've done a lot of work working closely with Rob at the ECA as well, developing clauses that help people negotiate a contract rather than just sign it, you know, just encouraging members to read the contract. Within that, so Len and a couple of colleagues as well have been helping to do contract reviews for members. And whilst we don't always get the changes we want, we do start to have the conversation. And as Len said, there's actually a little bit less resistance built into it when we're having the right conversation. So can we always get contracts changed? Not always, but more often than people thought we would when we went down the contract review process, if I'm honest. And we've had some really good examples of where members were asked to sign clauses which were utterly ridiculous. And when we went back, they basically said, yeah, no, you're not wrong. We can modify that. So I think there feels like there is a little bit less friction in the process than there used to be, but it does depend on the subsector, right? You know, I think housing is a particularly brutal part of construction. Commercial tends to be a little bit there tends to be a little bit more give and flex. So
Yeah,
so
no,
yeah,
no.
we do get some mixed, Jeremy.
No, but by actually asking the question, or your members being prepared to bring the questions forward, it's helping spread the word of the aims of the coalition. If you've got contractors who've never heard of CAP, well, I mean, as Lena said, well, they will do now because it's been brought to them, and in time that can encourage change as well.
We've also produced some simplified contracts ourselves as well. So we've produced some like standard simplified terms that members can use to try and reduce some of the areas where we see conflict around. And obviously we've baked the conflict avoidance process into those. And I think just as a final comment on that, I think one of the things is sometimes the immediacy of the project means that things don't necessarily change straight away. But for construction to really operate better, we've got to step outside the immediacy of the project and think about the next one and the one after. So sometimes having that conversation, even if it can't influence this one, there is an opportunity to get people to rethink how they behave moving forward and set the next contract up right.
Okay, no, excellent. I mean, I think one of the things that's important to mention about the FIS is that you are a gold member of the coalition. It's not just a case of having just signed the pledge. You're actively applying conflict avoidance processes, as you've been, you know, very helpfully describing how you and your members are trying to promote the use of conflict avoidance. How was the process to become a gold member for you? What type of things did you have to demonstrate?
Well, I mean, it was actually for us, it was relatively straightforward, thankfully, because as I say, sort of when you go back about sort of 3, 4, 5 years ago when we started on this process, we decided that we had, you know, we can't change the world on our own. So we have to work out sometimes where it's best to lean into and add our weight. So we decided that the conflict avoidance coalition, the conflict avoidance process was pivotal for us. So we have baked it in. So as a gold member, we're required to do certain things around making sure that we recommend any standard form contracts. Obviously, the standard form contracts we had to have it baked in, which they already did. And then we had to make sure that we provide and make training available to our members to support them in embedding the conflict avoidance process in their work. And again, we've got a range of, whilst we do it through almost every meeting, we talk about it, so it's kind of on the agenda. But we also then have a range of e-learning resources that support members in understanding contractual processes and implementing conflict avoidance more effectively. And some of those, again, have been, like this coalition, have been a great example of collaboration. So the basis of our contractual training course at the moment is a guide that we developed with colleagues up in Scotland, which is a best practice guide, which is free to download for everybody, the CICV best practice guide. Absolutely phenomenal piece of work done by about 4 or 5 really knowledgeable people up there that's just helping to educate and inform people. So we've really got behind that as well. So it's not like we're trying to do all of this on our own. We're trying to sort of funnel the right stuff through to our members so they can make the best possible decisions.
No, I mean that's all excellent, man, and sort of clear evidence of why you should be. Your organisation should be sort of a gold member, and I think it's something that all members of the coalition can look to and perhaps aspire to see they can achieve silver or gold membership like the FIS and indeed VVB. But just briefly, as I think we're sort of coming to an end, and again, I think many of the items and issues that you've already raised during our conversation, perhaps we can guess some of the things that you're going to say. What do you see is going to be happening in the future, or what would you like to happen in the future with the FICS and sort of working with the coalition?
I think for me, the next 2 years are pivotal for construction. I honestly believe we've never had a better opportunity to change our industry. Because, I mean, I had the opportunity to attend a building safety regulator meeting a couple of weeks ago, and I was asked absolutely the perfect question, which is, it was a 50-minute keynote I was asked to do, but the question was, where does the construction process undermine our ability to deliver competence? And naturally, one of the things I talked about was how we frame our contracts, because you have a duty holder regime, and your contracts need to reflect the duties. And they need to support us in delivering compliance. And at the moment, this process kind of sits outside of a lot of what construction people do. It's over there, the lawyers and the commercial team negotiate all that stuff, and then we crack on and do our best and hopefully avoid as much of the bun fight at the end. And some of the behaviour, some of the things you see in the way that we're sort of baking. There's a fantastic presentation that I won't claim any credit for that Richard Bartlett from Wilmot Dixon does about how price fluctuates during a job, because of the way that we behave and how we negotiate. And ultimately, we end up with sort of a price that was higher than we first thought it was going to be, or we pretended it was going to be in the tender process. And the time probably extended as well. But we don't have that honest conversation at the start, so we end up creating dispute at the end in order to get where we knew we were always probably going to get to. That's a sweeping generalisation. It's not true of every part of the industry. But we also know, we've got this sort of, we've got a mental health crisis in construction. I know there's a big piece of research coming out from the Construction Leadership Council next month, which is going to look at the impacts of some of the behaviours on the way that we are, the pressure that we're pushing through the supply chain, the impact that's having on people. And I think, so we're getting to that point where, nothing changes until it's harder to stay still. And I genuinely believe on this one, it's getting to that point where it's harder to stay still. We understand the problem. We've got regulatory push to encourage us to change. And I think even a lot of the design stuff now, we've been asked some really difficult questions almost on a daily basis, and they're the right questions. They're not always ones we've got answers to, but they're the right questions. So we know at the start of the job, people are starting to think more about these things, that pre-construction phase. The concept of the gateways is ideal, isn't it? Because you basically say we've got to finish all of that before we start the next bit. And whilst we're not there yet, and it's not necessarily expanded to the wider part of construction, that mindset is going to change behaviours, and it is going to improve culture. And I also think there's a new generation of people coming through that won't put up with this type of behaviour where we just bake in dispute and decide, well, build everything up until we have a big bun fight at the end of a job, and I don't think people are going to accept that kind of behaviour moving forward. So we will be forced to modernise by the people that are joining our sector.
Excellent. And wholeheartedly agree with you. You don't want to be storing things up to the end. And the coalition's got a number. For example, the coalition's got a toolbox setting out all the tools you can operate at early, as you keep stressing, Ian, at early stages of the contract to actually avoid these little differences and disputes emerging, and certainly to help people avoiding everything, saving up everything to the end, which is just a recipe for disaster. But thank you very much, Ian, for all the comments, everything you're doing with the FICS, and also for the summary of encouraging and the hope you set forth for how you see the next couple of years operating. But I think we've come to an end of our time. I don't know if there's anyone has any questions for Ian. If not, I will. Oh, Richard, I was going to hand back to you anyway, but you have a question.
I think, Ian, you've highlighted very well this conundrum, and I think it's something that we can take forward for the future. This idea that we have statutory adjudication, and I've looked at the chats, and I think that's right for any business to be able to go and get their debts paid within 28 days when they're just facing someone that won't pay a legitimate bill. But on the other hand, having this mechanism creates huge friction and stops the mediative processes, the conciliatory processes that actually we want to see in the contracts. And there are a few of you that on this call and elsewhere that are doing this, and I think if you've got a big enough budget, you can actually make it happen. But I think that's a conversation that we're going to take forward for the future, because baked-in friction is what I've heard, and the idea of setting for the divorce before you've set for the marriage is another really good picture of what we've done in the last 20, 30 years. So thank you very much. I now see Ed, Adrian with comments. So Edward, and then Adrian.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, appreciate Ian. You resist the temptation to ask me really challenging questions, so I'll try and keep this relatively easy to answer. But obviously, with the level of communication you have with your wide membership, what are the current biggest challenges you're finding that they're faced with? Is it around the contracts? Is it around sort of external pressures? Is it around all the behaviours they're finding in the industry?
Well, that's a big question, Ed. It's a little bit of all of those, right? I think I think the contract, the contract is sort of a symptom of the problem, and it ultimately becomes the cause of the dispute. But I think if I was to sort of take it right back, I think the design development process is probably our biggest issue at the moment, because lots of, as I say, there's kind of a fractionalisation of design, and the role of the principal contractor hasn't been fully understood by the regulator, and is not necessarily what we are seeing. The behaviours and the delivery of the principal contractor role isn't necessarily providing that collaboration in design that ideally we need to see. So we're seeing sort of design decisions just push through, and we see some horrific design clauses. One last week was you're responsible for all design elements associated with your package, whether you drew them or not. Paraphrased. So we're seeing those kind of clauses just absolutely cascading through the supply chain into packages where they never saw them before. I mean, it was sent to me by that clause was sent to me by a drylining contractor who was also going to cop for coordination with all other packages associated and interlinking. It was just so I think it's that sort of that design process. To be honest, we're still seeing payment issues as well. We're still seeing there's a credit crunch in construction at the top and the bottom of the industry, and work is a little bit lean in certain parts of the marketplace, and that's creating that's baking a lot more tension. And then the third one, so design on new projects, payment as ever, and then the legacy work starting to creep up the agenda as well. And this can be like 12, 14-year-old projects, right?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, as we discussed the other day with Aston's, it's a growing problem.
Adrian, one quick question.
Sure. Hi, Ian. Thanks for filling us in on your challenges. Really interesting. You mentioned some awareness training around working collaboratively. Would you mind putting that in a link if that's okay in the chat?
No problem at all. I'll put that straight up. Yeah, I mean it's if you wanted to get involved in it, just let me know and I can set you up about to have a go at it.
Definitely. Well, we're linked in, but I thought I'd speak to you directly. So yeah, I'm from the Institute for Collaborative Working. So obviously anything to promote the message, because it's one thing avoiding conflict, but you've got to lay the foundations, and it sounds like you're trying to do that. So that would be really interesting to see that, please.
Brilliant, no problem. Thanks. Thank you.
Thanks, Simon. Over to you.
Yeah, just a brief one. I'm currently coming back to work part-time, so my apologies for being absent over the last few months and supporting the CAC. But part of my role in supporting it is as chair of the toolkit refresh with Steve Blakey, who's also on the call, and others. And what I'd like is ideas for what you'd like to see in the toolkit refresh come to me, and then I can pick it up again with Steve and others. And if you email me, that's fine. But could you please head it up as CAC-toolkit refresh, so I can pick out the emails from the massive emails that I've got in my inbox at the moment.
Well, that's really great to see you here, Simon, and I'm pleased that you're back part-time. So I'm actually seeing Ashley later this week, but we'll try and have a separate conversation, the 3 or 4 of us, with Stephen as well. Great to see you, Stephen. It's my duty just to say thank you very much to our speakers, to Ian and to Ed, and to the chairs, Jeremy and Anthony. And I think we're starting to get to quite an interesting point where some ideas are starting to be consolidated, and I think we can take these to very high places. We've got our conference. We were hoping to have that in March, but that's now been put back to June. But we've got half a dozen sponsors. So we had a meeting earlier today, and that caused some of my IT issues. So apologies there. But it's definitely going ahead. Jeremy will be circulating more details over the coming weeks. We are looking for more sponsors. We want our sponsors to come and tell us about their businesses, as we've done today. We can see this as a regular slot every month for 2 or 3 businesses to talk about what they're doing, what CAC means to them, and what they would like to see us lobby for, because I think we are becoming, my sense of our role is that of lobbyists for good, for better practice, but not just being a talking shop, actually making sure that it can happen. So I'll say thank you very much. There'll be another call like this next month, and in the meantime we'll send out a newsletter and other information, and please look at the website, sign up at the website for news and mail, and thank you again. Goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.